Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we travel back to the time of the French Revolution to look at the little people left behind by the great waves of history and how they were born, how they lived, how they went hungry, how they loved, and how they grew old. Now dim the lights and let's step into tonight's story with the toll of church bells. On in day in the 1780s, in a small village in the Kingdom of France, a woman labored with all her strength on a wooden bed stuffed with hay, and then you were born. There was no hospital, no nurse to ring a bell, not even a proper midwife. The one who helped your mother give birth was the plump aunt next door, who raised 6 chickens. You weighed about 6 to 7 pounds when you were born. No one weighed you, nor recorded your height. The first official trace of your existence in this world was in the church's baptism register. A priest took a quill and scrawled your name, the names of your parents, the names of your godparents, and your baptism date in a thick sheepskin book. The house you were born in was a mix of stone and wood, with a thatched or slate roof. If you were lucky enough to live in the south, winters were not too cold. If you were unlucky in Normandy or Brittany in the north, you would have a childhood that was cold and damp, forever filled with a musty smell. The first thing you remembered when you were about 3 or 4 years old was hunger. You squatted on the threshold, watching your mother break a loaf of black bread into 4 pieces, one for father, one for mother, one for you, and the piece for your newborn little brother was chewed up by mother and fed to him. The bread was hard, grey in colour, mixed with bran, rye, and even possibly ground chestnut shells. You bit into it, your mouth full of a rough texture, but you didn't care. You were just too hungry. For an ordinary French peasant family, 70 to 80% of their daily calorie intake came from bread. There was no meat, occasionally a little cheese, or a bowl of vegetable soup so thin you could see your reflection in it. But bread was always the core. The summer of 1788 brought a fierce hailstorm that hit vast farmlands in central and northern France, beating the crops to a pulp. Then came a once-in-a-century severe cold at winter, freezing the Seine River solid. The water mills on the river could not operate, so no wheat could be ground. Under this double blow, the price of flour soared. By early 1789, a family of 4 had to spend more than 80% of their income just on bread. Back then, your father left before dawn every day to work, toiling himself to the bone, and the money he earned all day turned almost entirely into bread. There was no spare money for clothes, no spare money to repair the roof, let alone any savings for emergencies. Your family was like walking a tightrope. A little wind and rain would send the whole family tumbling down. You, of course, did not understand any of this. You only knew that mother's face had grown increasingly grim. Father said less and less when he came home, and the bread for dinner got smaller and smaller. One night, you heard mother whisper to father in the dark, "If this goes on, the children won't make it through the winter." You didn't quite understand what that meant, but you instinctively pulled the quilt tighter around yourself. You grew older and began to work in the fields with father, pulling weeds, picking up stones, chasing away birds. Your hands quickly became rough, with mud stuck under your fingernails that you could never wash clean. You did not think this was hard because all the children in the village lived like this. You didn't even know there was another way to live in the world. All you knew was bread, dirt, and hunger. That was your world, your entire world. When you were about 7 or 8 years old, a strange sense of excitement began to spread in the village. Adults spoke louder when they gathered, and arguments in the tavern at the village entrance became more frequent. You didn't quite understand what they were talking about, but a few words repeated themselves, sticking in your ears like nails. The king, Paris, the estates, general. In the spring of 1789, Louis XVI decided to convene the Estates General meeting that had not been held since 1614, 175 long years before. Why the sudden call? Simply put, the king was broke. France's national treasury was empty. A huge sum had been spent on helping the Americans fight their Revolutionary War. The maintenance of the Palace of Versailles was a bottomless pit, and the nobility and the church enjoyed extensive tax exemptions. The burden of taxation fell almost entirely on the Third Estate. On an day, father came back from the market with news that stunned the whole family. He said the king had asked everyone to write down their grievances. To prepare for the Estates General, Louis XVI ordered the collection of Here's de doléances, lists of grievances, across the country. Every parish, every guild, every village was required to write one, recording the common people's complaints, demands, and wishes to be taken to Paris. Your village's cahier was written in the church. Nearly all the adult men in the village came that day. The village's only literate primary school teacher was chosen as the scribe. Every Oone chipped in with their grievances. The taxes are too heavy. Bread is too expensive. The Lord's pigeons ate my crops, and I can't even chase them away. In France at that time, lords held a privilege known as the droit de Columbia, the right to keep pigeons. These pigeons flew everywhere, eating the grain in peasants' fields, yet peasants could not harm them. It was one of the feudal privileges that infuriated peasants the most. As a result, the demand abolish the droit de Columbia code be found in almost every rural cahier de doléances. When the cahier was finished, it was folded, sealed with wax, and handed to the village's elected representative. This representative would first go to a county meeting, where delegates for the province would be chosen, and finally, the provincial delegates would take all the cahiers to Paris. You remembered the atmosphere that day. It was the first time you saw something in the adult's eyes you had never seen before. You grew older and began to work in the fields with father, pulling weeds, picking up stones, chasing away birds. Your hands quickly became rough, with mud stuck under your fingernails that you could never wash clean. You did not think this was hard, because all the children in the village lived like this. You didn't even know there was another way to live in the world. All you knew was bread, dirt, and hunger. That was your world, your entire world. When you were about 7 or 8 years old, a strange sense of excitement began to spread in the village. Adults spoke louder when they gathered, and arguments in the tavern at the village entrance became more frequent. You didn't quite understand what they were talking about, but a few words repeated themselves, sticking in your ears like nails. The king, Paris, the Estates General. In the spring of 1789, Louis XVI decided to convene the Estates General meeting that had not been held since 1614, 175 long years before. Why the sudden call? Simply put, the king was broke. France's national treasury was empty. A huge sum had been spent on helping the Americans fight their Revolutionary War. The maintenance of the Palace of Versailles was a bottomless pit, and the nobility and the church enjoyed extensive tax exemptions. The burden of taxation fell almost entirely on the Third Estate. Onin Day, father came back from the market with news that stunned the whole family. He said the king had asked everyone to write down their grievances. To prepare for the Estates General, Louis XVI ordered the collection of Cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances. Every parish, every guild, every village was required to write one, recording the common people's complaints, demands, and wishes, to be taken to Paris. Your village's cahier was written in the church. Nearly all the adult men in the village came that day. The village's only literate primary school teacher was chosen as the scribe. Every one chipped in with their grievances. The taxes are too heavy. Bread is too expensive. The Lord's pigeons ate my crops, and I can't even chase them away. In France at that time, lords held a privilege known as the droit de Colombier, the right to keep pigeons. These pigeons flew everywhere, eating the grain in peasants' fields, yet peasants could not harm them. It was one of the feudal privileges that infuriated peasants the most. As a result, the demand to abolish the droit de Colombier could be found in almost every rural cahier de doléances. When the cahier was finished, it was folded, sealed with wax, and handed to the village's elected representative. This representative would first go to a county meeting, where delegates for the province would be chosen. And finally, the provincial delegates would take all the cahiers to Paris. You remembered the atmosphere that day. It was the first time you saw something in the adult's eyes you had never seen before. It was not just anger, it was more like hope. It was as if something momentous was about to happen, as if they finally had a chance to say enough to someone.
Chapitre 1 La Journée et du marché, Madame Nicole Demers vient entrer au supermarché avec Lucas et Clara. Les deux enfants adorent parcourir la salle devant le remontre. Lucas aime découvrir de nouvelles saveurs. Il raffole de tout ce qui est sucré froid. Vince dit il s'assure de 6 ans. Allons voir les cités, les et les desserts. Regarde, exclame Clara, en une nouvelle sorte de borrade d'arachide. Tout plus cru qu'amoxtontu, lit elle avec difficulté. Tu puis elle ajoute, surtaste encore miller avec de la confiture. Aux fraises et pois. Fait Lucas, avec du mio, putois, mais la garonne, cesse de parler. Un hours immense vient d'apparat. Toi cobautiolo. Il se dirige, algrement vers Yukos. Saisette la main de Clara. Elle y place devant elle, prêtie à la défendre. Ma dit elle y en iti dando, pas dando, un gros tuto, une peluche, illus ardi devant, les enfants et dit, y bonjour. J.M. appel patapluche, Venice par ICI, J.I. unibel, surprise pour vous zdorf.
You started to notice more and more people in the village wearing something on their chests. A small cockade, twisted together with 3 colors, blue, white, and red. You thought it was quite pretty. One day you asked Mother, "What is that?" Mother hesitated for a moment and said, "It just means you support the revolution." "What is the revolution?" Mother did not answer. She probably wasn't quite sure of the answer herself. The tricolour cockade was one of the most famous symbols of the French Revolution. Blue and red were the traditional colours of Paris, and white was the colour of the Bourbon monarchy. Twisting them together symbolized the unity of the king and the people, or at least, that was the original meaning. As events unfolded, white gradually came to represent the nation, not the king. In the early days of the revolution, wearing the tricolour cockade quickly became an identity marker. Wearing it meant you were a supporter of the revolution, a good citizen. Not wearing it made you suspicious. Father bought 2 cockades at the market, spending just a few sous, not expensive. He pinned one on his hat and the other on your collar. You felt like a little hero, but you noticed the village's old priest looking at these cockades with a complicated gaze. That was the subtlety of the early revolution. It pushed everyone into a position where they had to choose. Not an abstract choice of whether you agreed with a certain policy, but a concrete, visible choice worn on your body. When you walked down the street, others could tell at a glance which side you were on. In Paris, the meaning of the tricolour cockade was taken to an extreme. Records show that during the fiercest days of the revolution, people who did not wear the cockade would be stopped on the street, questioned, even beaten. In the summer of 1789, several foreign envoys in Paris were surrounded by an angry crowd for not wearing the tricolour cockade, nearly leading to a serious incident. After that, even foreigners in Paris dutifully pinned on this little flower. But in your small village, things were not so extreme. The tricolour cockade was more like a fashion statement. You noticed that the village's more energetic young people were the first to wear it, and the elderly and those close to the church were the last. A few people never wore it at all, usually the most loyal of the Lord's tenants, or those who truly had no interest in politics. Besides the cockade, you also started to hear new words. Citoyen, citizen, a new term to replace monsieur. From now on, you no longer called your neighbor Monsieur Dubois. You called him Citoyen Dubois. This change sounded small, but it carried great meaning. Under the old regime, the title Monsieur implied class differences. The nobility were messieurs, commoners were messieurs, and peasants might not even be worthy of the title. But now everyone was a citoyen. Everyone was equal. Those 4 words, liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity, were easy to say, but incredibly hard to practice. You would soon find that even those who preached fraternity had vastly different understandings of what equality truly meant. But that was all in the future. In that moment, in your village, in the autumn of 1789, everything was still filled with naive optimism. The cockades were new, the words were new, and in the air there was a sense that everything would get better. Father even smiled and said to Mother, "Maybe next year we'll get to eat white bread." When you were about 10 years old, one Sunday morning, you followed Mother to church for Mass as usual, but the church doors were closed that day. A notice was nailed to the wooden planks, written in official language you could barely understand, and a few men wearing tricolor cockades stood beside it, arms crossed over their chests, looking stern. Mother stood at the church door for a long time, stunned. In 1790, the revolutionary government passed the civil constitution of the clergy. This law did several things. First, church property was nationalized. All the land, monasteries, and valuable items in churches belonging to the church became state property. Second, priests were now to be elected public officials, paid by the state. Some priests took the oath of allegiance to the new government. They thought it was the tide of the times, or at the very least, that opposing the new government was not a wise move. But a large number of priests refused to swear the oath. They believed their primary loyalty was to the Pope in Rome, not to some revolutionary government in Paris. The Pope soon condemned the law, further deepening the rift. In your village, the consequences of this division were direct and tangible. The old priest you had known since childhood refused to take the oath, so he was removed from his post. In his place came a constitutional priest sent from another town, a young man no one knew. Mother did not like the new priest, and neither did many of the village's elderly. They thought he was not proper. It was not that he had any moral failings, but his way of saying Mass was different from the old priests. His tone of reciting prayers was wrong. More importantly, he was sent by the government, and this made many devout villagers feel that the purity of religion had been tainted by politics. Mother began to secretly attend Mass held by the old priest in the cellar of a peasant's house, the windows covered tightly with cloth curtains. The people who went were all familiar faces from the village, singing hymns in hushed voices, the light of candles flickering on the low ceiling. You did not understand why Mass had to be such a secret affair. It was just prayer, wasn't it? But when you saw the look of both piety and fear on Mother's face, you knew something had changed. In fact, during the Revolution, a movement known as the cult of reason emerged in France. Some radical revolutionaries tried to replace Christianity with reason, turning churches into temples of reason, where they held various ceremonies, even having real people play the goddess of reason. Notre Dame de Paris was once transformed into a temple of reason, with a small hill built inside, and an actress in a white robe sitting on top, symbolizing the victory of reason. For Mother, her Sundays were ruined. Her prayers had become a dangerous thing, and the church where she had grown up had become a strange place. Father was not as devout as Mother. He cared more about something else. After the church's land was confiscated, it was divided into small plots and auctioned off. This should have been a good chance for the poor to acquire land, but in reality, most of the land was bought by wealthy townsfolk and shrewd merchants. Because the auctions required cash, and peasants had no cash at all, Father stood on the edge of the auction site, watching the plot of church land he had tilled for more than a decade be bought at a high price by a well-dressed gentleman from the city. He said nothing and turned to walk home. No one spoke at your house that night. One morning, Father stood at the door, dazed, holding a crumpled piece of paper. He said, "Today is not Wednesday anymore. Today is the 13th day of Vendemiaire." In 1793, the revolutionary government abolished the millennia-old Gregorian calendar and introduced a brand new republican calendar. This new calendar divided the year into 12 months, 30 days each, with each month split into 3 decades of 10 days. In other words, the Sunday you used to rest every 7 days was now replaced by a day of rest every 10 days. This single change alone was enough to make working people across France rebel. Losing about a third of their rest days was no trivial matter. What confused you even more was the new names for the months. The old January and February were discarded, and the new months had entirely new names, based on the seasons and natural phenomena. Vendemiaire grape harvest, Brumaire fog, Frimaire frost, Nevises snow, Pluvies Rheindises wind, germinal budding, floreal, flowering, perennial, Messidor harvest, Thermidor heat, Fructidor fruit. The names themselves were quite poetic, but the problem was you could never remember whether it was Brumaire or Frimaire, whether the market was on the 20th or 21st of Vendemiaire. Converting between the old and new calendars gave every ordinary person a terrible headache. Besides the months, each day also got a new name. Under the old calendar, each day was dedicated to a Catholic saint, St. Paul's Day, St. Anne's Day, and so on. The new calendar abolished all of these, replacing them with the names of plants, animals, and farming tools. You would find that your birthday had become Carrot Day, and your neighbor's birthday was Manure Day. In addition, the revolutionary government encouraged people to give their children revolutionary names. Traditional Catholic saint names fell out of favor, replaced by various ideals and concepts. You were grateful you had been born before the revolution with a normal name. In truth, the republican calendar never truly took root among the people. Most French people continued to use the old calendar in private, only resorting to the new one when dealing with the government. When Napoleon came to power, he officially abolished the republican calendar in 1806 and restored the Gregorian calendar. Father probably never figured out which month Vendemiaire was, not from start to finish. When you were about 13 or 14 years old, you came home from school one day and found the door of Uncle Pierre's house next door tightly closed. "Where's Uncle Pierre?" you asked Mother. Mother's face paled, and she whispered, "Don't ask. Eat your dinner, the terror has come." From the autumn of 1793 to the summer of 1794, for about 10 months, France was engulfed in a massive political purge, launched by the revolutionary government itself. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre, seized power, and in the name of defending the revolution, unleashed the reign of terror. In Paris, the face of the terror was bloody trials and public executions. But in your small village, the face of the terror was something else. Suspicion and denunciation became part of daily life. Those who expressed doubt about the revolution, those who hid non-juring priests, those who hoarded grain or refused to sell goods at official prices. Every neighborhood quarrel could escalate into an anonymous denunciation letter sent to the local revolutionary committee. Uncle Pierre had been reported. The person who accused him said he had spoken ill of the revolution in private. You never found out exactly what he said. Maybe he complained about the price of bread. Maybe he expressed dissatisfaction with a certain official. Maybe he said nothing at all. And it was just a grudge against someone. In that era, the power of an anonymous denunciation letter was unimaginable. 2 men in dark coats came to the village and took Uncle Pierre away. His wife chased after them, crying and shouting, but was held back by others. You stood behind the window, watching it all, your heart pounding wildly. Uncle Pierre never came back. You later learned he had been taken to the county town, tried in a revolutionary tribunal. These tribunals handed down judgments at an astonishing speed. Sometimes they tried dozens of people a day, with each trial lasting only a few minutes. During the Reign of Terror, about 16,000 people across France were officially sentenced to death and executed. The number of people arrested and imprisoned is estimated to be between 300,000 and 500,000. In a country with a total population of about 28 million, this meant roughly 1 out of every 50 or 60 people was arrested. Your village was small, with only a few hundred residents, but at least 3 or 4 people were taken away during the Reign of Terror. One of them was the old non-juring priest you had known before. He was found hiding in the attic of a family's house, and when he was dragged out, he was still reciting prayers. So the story went. After that, you changed. You learned to look around to see if anyone was listening before you spoke. You learned not to express an opinion on any political topic, to smile proactively, to greet others proactively, to show the tricolor cockade on your chest proactively. You learned to make yourself invisible. Mother changed too. She no longer went to the secret mass in the cellar, not because she didn't want to, but because it was too dangerous. Word spread that there was an informer among those who had gone the last time. Father fell silent. He no longer talked about anything political at the dinner table. He just ate with his head down, worked with his head down, slept with his head down. He shrank himself down to the smallest possible size, like a hedgehog facing danger, hiding all its soft parts away. Historians still argue today about the necessity of the Reign of Terror. Some believe that in the critical moment of foreign invasion and internal rebellion, iron-fisted measures were the only way to save the Republic. Others believe that the Reign of Terror fundamentally betrayed the original ideals of the revolution. Defending freedom with violence is a contradiction in itself. You did not care about these grand narratives. You only knew that the weeds in Uncle Pierre's yard next door had grown knee-high, and his dog still waited for him at the door. Sometimes you had to walk past the square where a machine stood. It had a tall wooden frame with a piece of metal hanging from the top. You knew what it was, but you refused to think about it. You just kept your head down, hurried your steps, and pretended the machine did not exist. The guillotine was the most iconic and also the most unsettling invention of the French Revolution. Strictly speaking, it was not an invention of the French Revolution at all. Similar devices had existed in medieval Europe. You saw the guillotine for the first time in the county town, on the way to the market with Father. It stood in the center of the square, a wooden platform with two tall posts rising from it, a track between the posts, and a heavy angled steel blade hanging from the top. At the height of the Reign of Terror, the guillotine was in operation almost every day. In Paris's Place de la Révolution, sometimes dozens of people were executed in a single day. Among the onlookers, some cheered, some stared blankly, some turned pale, but almost no one left. It was not that they wanted to watch. It was that in that era, not being present at an execution might be seen as a lack of enthusiasm for the revolution. Your county town did not have such frequent executions, but they happened occasionally. On the days an execution was scheduled, you could feel the air of the entire town grow thick and heavy. People walked faster on the streets, some hurrying toward the square, some hurrying in the opposite direction. During the Reign of Terror, a group of women known as the tricoteuses, the knitting women, emerged in Paris. They brought their knitting every day, sat in the stands beside the guillotine, and knitted sweaters while watching the executions, as if it were a daily street show. This image was later immortalized in Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities in the character of Madame Defarge. The existence of these tricoteuses has left later generations both confused and disturbed. Humanity's ability to adapt to violence is sometimes more terrifying than violence itself. Father forbade you from going to watch the executions. That's not something you should see, he said, his tone unusually stern. You did not argue. In his eyes, you read something he did not say. Maybe fear, maybe anger, maybe just deep exhaustion. But you could not escape it entirely. The sounds would reach you, the faint hubbub and drumbeats from the square. Then a sudden silence, followed by another outburst of noise. You did not need to be there. Your imagination filled in the rest of the picture. You started having nightmares. In the dreams, there was a towering wooden frame, so tall it pierced the sky. You ran as hard as you could in the dream, but your feet were stuck in mud, unable to move an inch. You woke up before dawn, Mother's hand on your forehead. Did you have a bad dream? She whispered. You nodded and buried your face in her arms. In your memories, the revolution seemed like a man's affair. They debated in taverns. They gathered in squares. They charged at the Bastille with weapons in hand. But if you thought carefully, you would find that in those days, many of the bravest people were women. In October 1789, thousands of Parisian women, enraged by the shortage of bread, organized themselves spontaneously and marched from Paris to the Palace of Versailles to demand bread from the king. This is known in history textbooks as the October Days. You did not witness this event firsthand, but you heard Mother talk about it. Those women walked about 12 miles, many barefoot, in the autumn rain. When they reached the Palace of Versailles, they forced their way in, and they brought the royal family back to Paris from Versailles. From then on, the king was housed in the Tuileries Palace in Paris and never returned to Versailles. When Mother told this story, there was something in her voice you rarely heard from her, a proud warmth. She said those women had more guts than the men. The early years of the revolution saw a group of remarkable female activists. Perhaps the most famous was Olympe de Gouges, who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of the female citizen in 1791, simply replacing the word man with woman in the original declaration. In the declaration, she wrote, "If woman has the right to mount the scaffold, she must also have the right to mount the rostrum." In 1793, she was sent to the guillotine by the Jacobins, charged with attempting to interfere in politics. Mother had no idea who Olympe de Gouges was. Mother's world was much smaller and much more practical. Her revolution was figuring out how to feed the whole family as flour grew more and more expensive, how to secretly arrange religious activities after the old priest was driven away, and how to support the family alone. In your village, women's daily lives did not change in essence because of the revolution. They were still the ones who cooked, who washed clothes, who raised children, who fetched water from the spring. But they also took on new roles. They became the ones who stood in line for bread. During the revolution, especially in times of scarcity, queuing to buy rationed bread became a time-consuming and exhausting daily chore. A chore almost entirely borne by women. Sometimes the line stretched from before dawn until noon. Mother left before dawn every day, wrapped in a thin scarf, and stood in the long line outside the bakery. The women in the line talked in hushed tones, exchanged news, complained about prices, and discussed which family's husband had been conscripted into the army. This bread line was, in a sense, their parliament, an information exchange and mutual aid network with no official status, but one that functioned nonetheless. You watched Mother's back as she left before dawn every day to stand in line, and thought she was the bravest person in the world. You never said it out loud. A teenage boy was too embarrassed to say such sappy things, but you stored that thought in a corner of your heart. Many years later, when all the political memories had faded, you still remembered that back vanishing into the early morning mist, wrapped in a thin scarf. You started to learn to manage the family's money, not because you had any business sense, but because Mother was simply too busy. She spent half the day every day standing in line for bread, and the rest of the time taking care of your younger brothers and sisters. But managing money in that era became a maddening task. After the 1789 revolution, the new government faced a huge problem. The national treasury was empty. What to do? Print money. So they issued a new paper currency called assignats, initially backed by the nationalized church lands. In theory, you could exchange an assignat for a piece of land of corresponding value. The problem was that the government printed more and more assignats, while the total amount of land was fixed. Inflation set in, not mild inflation, but hyperinflation so extreme it defied belief. In 1790, a 100 livre assignat had a real purchasing power of about 90 livres. By 1795, the same 100 livre assignat was worth less than 1 livre in real terms. In other words, if you had saved 100 livres in 1790, a considerable sum for a peasant family 5 years later, that money could barely buy a few eggs. Father had a small iron box wrapped in rags, hidden under a brick in the house. The family's life savings. Every time Father put an assignat into the box, his expression was complicated. As the assignats continued to depreciate, the French people spontaneously returned to a barter system. You took a basket of eggs to the bakery, and the baker was far happier to see eggs than assignats. A blacksmith repaired a hoe, and you could pay with a bag of flour. Metal coins, especially gold and silver ones, became the most sought-after items because precious metals had intrinsic value. Unlike paper money that could be printed at will, a makeshift unofficial exchange rate quickly emerged in your village. One chicken equaled a certain number of pounds of flour. A day's labor equaled a certain number of eggs. This system was maintained entirely by trust and verbal agreements between neighbors. When the assignats depreciated to the point of absurdity, a strange phenomenon emerged in Paris. People used assignats to paper their walls. Because the paper quality of the assignats was quite good, and it worked better than newspaper, some people even folded large denomination assignats into paper airplanes for their children to play with. Your once valuable money now had its greatest use as wallpaper and toys. Your family never reached that point, but you experienced a scene you would never forget. Mother took a thick stack of assignats to the market to buy a bag of flour. The uncle selling flour counted the paper money for a long time, then shook his head and said, "Add a little more." Mother pulled out a few more notes, and the uncle shook his head again. Finally, Mother put all the paper money in her pocket on the table. The uncle looked at the pile of paper, sighed, and reluctantly handed over a bag of flour, one noticeably smaller than the normal size. Mother said nothing on the walk back home. In 1796, the government finally admitted the assignats were a complete failure and tried to replace them with a new paper currency called mandats territoriaux. This new currency depreciated even faster, becoming almost worthless as soon as it was printed. In the end, when Napoleon came to power, he stabilized France's monetary system, again with metal currency. For you, the only lesson from this experience was simple. Paper is just paper, and grain is grain. For the rest of your life, you retained a deep-seated distrust of paper money. You preferred to exchange money for tangible things you could see and touch. A bag of grain, a chicken, a piece of iron. This childhood trauma never faded. When you were 16 years old, an official document was delivered to your door. Father glanced at it, and his face turned pale. It was a conscription order. In August 1793, the revolutionary government issued the famous Levayan Mass, the mass conscription. It was the first true universal mobilization in human history. All unmarried men between the ages of 18 and 25 were required to enlist in the army. The far-reaching impact of this decree cannot be overstated. It not only provided France with an unprecedentedly large army, but also changed the entire European understanding of war. From then on, war was no longer the affair of kings and mercenaries. It was the affair of the entire nation. You were still 2 years away from the conscription age, but your older cousin Baptiste was not so lucky. He had just turned 18 and had not even had the chance to confess his love to the girl from the next village when the conscription order arrived. Baptiste stood at your door for a moment, saying goodbye to Mother. Mother stuffed a hard loaf of bread and a pair of hand-knitted socks into his pocket. He tried to smile, but his lips would not lift. You walked with him to the village entrance. He looked back one last time at the familiar houses, the old oak tree, the muddy road leading to the fields. Then he turned and walked away, following a group of other young boys, all equally young, all confused, along the main road toward the county town. He never came back. You did not know where he died on the battlefield, by the Rhine River, on the muddy plains of the Low Countries, or on a mountain road in the Alps. You did not know. There were no casualty notices in that era. He just disappeared, like a drop of water merging into the sea. France declared war on Austria in 1792, and soon after was at war with almost all of Europe. The reason was to defend the revolution, to stop Europe's monarchs from uniting, to destroy the French Republic. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, the Netherlands, and other countries did form a coalition against France, and they did want to crush the French Revolution and restore the Bourbon dynasty. So in a sense, France really was fighting for its survival. But for you and your family, these geopolitical calculations were too far away. You only knew that there were fewer and fewer young men in the village, and more of the farm work fell on the shoulders of women, the elderly, and children. Your 16-year-old back began to hunch because you bent over to work from dawn till dusk every day. 2 years later, you were conscripted into the army too. You were assigned to an infantry company and given an ill-fitting military uniform, a pair of stiff boots, and a rifle you barely knew how to use. The training was short. It felt like they did not care if you could shoot, only if you could march in a line. You left home, and you did not dare look back. You knew that if you turned around and saw Mother standing at the door, you would not be able to take another step. You hated this war, but you also vaguely felt you were protecting something. Maybe your village, maybe your mother. On the march, the only thing playing in your mind was not some patriotic song, but the taste of Mother's vegetable soup so thin you could see your reflection in it. You came back alive. It was a miracle. Your infantry company had set out with more than 120 men. Fewer than 40 came back. You had a few new scars on your body, one on your left arm, grazed by shrapnel, one on your right leg, and you could not quite remember how you got it. The day you returned to the village, the reign of terror was over. On the 27th of July, 1794, the 9th of Thermidor in the Republican calendar, Robespierre was overthrown by his own colleagues. He and his followers were sent to the guillotine. This coup d'état is known as the Thermidorian reaction, and it marked the official end of the reign of terror. You heard the news while on the march. A courier rode past the column, shouting loudly, "The tyrant Robespierre has been brought to justice. Long live the Republic." You and your fellow soldiers stared at each other in silence. 6 months earlier, shouting "Long live Robespierre" had been political correctness. Now he was suddenly a tyrant. You were skin and bones when you got home. Mother's first reaction when she saw you was not to hug you, but to grab your hands, turn them over and over, counting to make sure all your fingers were still there. When she confirmed they were, her eyes filled with tears. But you soon found that even though the reign of terror was over, life did not get any better. A new government called the Directory was formed, a regime with a terrible reputation in history: corrupt, weak, and chaotic. It had neither the iron-fisted means of the Jacobins to maintain order, nor the ability to solve the problems of inflation and scarcity. In your village, the days after Thermidor had a strange atmosphere. Fear faded away, But it was not replaced by relief. It was replaced by a deeper exhaustion. Everyone was tired. For 5 or 6 years, from 1789 to now, your village had experienced hope, panic, terror, and war. Every single person was like a towel that had been wrung dry over and over again. You found that the villagers no longer wanted to talk about what had happened in the past few years. Those who had actively participated in denunciations during the Reign of Terror now avoided other people's eyes when walking down the street. The families who had been caught up in denunciations said nothing out loud, but you could feel a silent rift between neighbors. Uncle Pierre's wife still lived next door, raising 3 children alone, living in silence. Sometimes when you walked past her house, you would see her sitting at the door mending clothes, her expression as calm as a still pond. You wanted to say something, but every time you just nodded and walked on. After the Thermidorian reaction, a cultural phenomenon known as the Thermidorian reaction emerged in French society. In Paris, a group of young people known as the Incroyables and Merveilleus's suddenly appeared. They wore extremely extravagant clothes, tight pants, fluffy cravats, transparent gauze dresses, and frequented balls and salons, speaking in an affected accent. It was as if they wanted to retaliate against the repression of the Reign of Terror with excess. It was said that some of the Merveilleuses even wore a red ribbon around their necks, mimicking the mark left by the guillotine, using black humor to dispel fear. There were also events called Danse Macabre balls, rumored to be only for those who had lost family members during the Reign of Terror. These fashionable Parisian stories had nothing to do with you. Your post-Thermidor life was dragging your injured leg back to the fields, picking up the hoe again, finding that the plot of land that had once been yours had become overgrown and neglected after years of being untended, and lying in bed at night with the sound of gunfire from the battlefield still ringing in your ears, jerking awake to find yourself in the dark bedroom with your little brothers breathing beside you. You were home, but something had been left on that march, never to be found again. When you were in your early 20s, a new name began to spread across France: Napoleon Bonaparte. You heard this name for the first time at the market. A peddler from the city was selling needles and thread and chatting loudly. Heard the news. There's a general named Bonaparte who won a great victory in Italy. You did not pay much attention at the time. Since the start of the revolution, you had heard too many names of heroes: Lafayette, Mirabeau, Danton, Robespierre. Each one once praised to the heavens, then cast down. You had learned to view such things with tired wariness. But this time was different. On the 9th of November, 1799, the 18th of Brumaire in the Republican calendar, Napoleon launched a coup d'état, overthrowing the weak Directory, establishing the consulate, and making himself first consul. 3 years later, in 1804, he placed the crown on his own head in Notre Dame de Paris and became Emperor of the French. You heard the news while turning over the soil in the fields. You stuck your hoe into the ground and muttered, "So we killed one king and ended up with another emperor." Father heard you and patted the back of your head gently. "Keep your voice down." But after Napoleon came to power, some things did get better. The most obvious was monetary stability. Napoleon established the Bank of France and issued the franc, backed by gold, and silver. The nightmare of the assignat era, when paper money was worth less than toilet paper, was finally over. When father put a silver franc into the iron box, his expression was much more at ease than when he had put in assignats. Another change was the Napoleonic Code, enacted in 1804. This code unified civil law across France. Before this, northern France followed customary law, and southern France followed Roman law. The legal provisions across the country were a mess. Now, no matter where you were in France, property rights, marriage law, and inheritance law all had uniform provisions. For you, the most direct impact of this code was on land. It confirmed the legal ownership of those who had bought nationalized land during the Revolution. This meant that old man Lee next door, who had bought a piece of former church land during the Revolution, no longer had to worry about losing it if the old regime was restored one day. But the code also had parts that made you uncomfortable, especially the provisions on women. Mother was now legally defined as someone who must obey her husband. She could not sign a contract or do business without father's consent, and even had far fewer rights than men in divorce. You thought this was wrong. Mother had propped up half the family over the past few years, sometimes the entire family. While implementing his reforms, Napoleon also restored some elements of the old regime. For example, he signed the Concordat of 1801 with the Roman Catholic Church, reinstating Catholicism as the official religion of France. Though it was not the state religion as it had been under the old regime, at least the churches opened their doors officially again. When Mother heard the news, it was the first time in years she had truly smiled. She no longer had to attend secret mass in cellars. But peace did not last long. New wars came soon enough, and on an even larger scale. Napoleon's ambitions extended far beyond France. He wanted to conquer Europe. This meant more conscription orders. You had already retired from the army. Your injured right leg made you unfit for marching. But your younger brothers were not so lucky. Your youngest brother had just turned 18 when he was taken away by a new round of conscription. You walked him to the village entrance and thought of the day years earlier when you had walked Baptiste to the same spot, the same village entrance, the same muddy road, the same words left unsaid. You grew old. You were not sure exactly how old you were, maybe 50, maybe 55. In that era, that was already considered a ripe old age. Your hair was mostly white, and your right leg ached faintly on cloudy days. The first thing you did every morning was sit on the wooden chair at the door of your house and watch the sun slowly climb over the mountain opposite. The village had changed, and yet it had not changed at all. The church was open again, and after all those years of upheaval, Mass was back. The new priest was not the old one you had known as a child, but a middle-aged man, soft-spoken, who rarely talked about politics. The price of bread was stable, and there was occasionally a little meat on your family's dinner table, usually salted pork or a small piece of chicken. But compared to your childhood, when every meal was black bread and thin soup, this was already an incredible improvement. The fields were still the same fields, but the property rights had changed. Your family now officially owned a small plot of land, no longer tenants of the Lord. This was the most tangible legacy the Revolution left you. You no longer had to pay all kinds of bizarre feudal obligations. no longer had to send eggs when the Lord's cat had kittens, no longer had to tolerate the Lord's pigeons eating your crops. You were the master of your own land. This change, you truly thought, was for the better, but your cousin Baptiste never came back. Your youngest brother came back alive from Napoleon's military campaigns, but he was missing 3 fingers. Uncle Pierre was gone forever. The old priest you had known as a child died in prison. Your mother, she had endured everything during the years you were in the army, but her health broke down in her 40s. She had a cough for years and finally passed away quietly on a winter morning. You did not make it back in time to see her for the last time. Sometimes you sat at the door and wondered what had happened all these years. When you were born, France had a king. Then the king was beheaded. Then came a republic. Then came the Reign of Terror. Then the Reign of Terror ended. Then came the Directory. Then came a consul. Then an emperor who fought a bunch of wars. Then the emperor was exiled. Then a king came back, not the original one, but the brother of the beheaded king. You replayed these events in your mind, and it felt like a very long, not very funny joke. Sometimes your neighbor would bring a chair and sit beside you, and you two would sunbathe together, hardly speaking. Occasionally he would say, "Do you remember the old days?" You would nod and not say anything more. Of course you remembered. You remembered the taste of bread, that sour, hard black bread. You remembered the feeling of the tricolor cockade pinned to your chest. You remembered the sound of Uncle Pierre's dog barking the day he was taken away. You remembered Mother's back, wrapped in a thin scarf, standing in line for bread. You remembered your cousin's last glance back at the village. You remembered the day you left for the army, not daring to look back. You remembered everything, but you could not put it into words. Those things were too big to express with the limited words you had learned in your life. You were just an ordinary person. You never stormed the Bastille, never spoke at the National Assembly, never led any army. You just survived. In an era where kings were beheaded, calendars were rewritten, money turned into worthless paper, and neighbors disappeared in the night you survived. That in itself is already an extraordinary story. The sun sank slowly. The clouds on the horizon dyed orange, then purple, then gradually darkening. You stood up, pushed open the creaky door, and walked into the house.